Tonight we look at the story that has been told about the murder of JonBenet Ramsey and why so many think her parents guilty, and what this tells us about the America she so briefly lived in.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Welcome from a very hot and humid South Africa. It's 87 degrees Fahrenheit, that's about 31 Celsius. It's also really humid. It's hot and humid today. I don't know what it's like where you are in the world. Of course, wherever you are in the world, the seasons are rapidly shifting from summer to winter where I am to winter to summer where you are. And who knows what the shifts are for other things like the coronavirus. In this episode 39, dealing with knives, knots and Boy Scouts, and in that order, we're going to look at a completely new dimension in the JonBenet Ramsey case. You know, when I watch documentaries that over and over again say we still don't know who killed JonBenet, it's still a mystery 24 years later, and then they go through the same crap again. They sort of shovel through the same photos, the same statements, the same nonsense, and you sort of wonder, why haven't you solved this case after almost a quarter of a century? Well, it's because you're thinking about it in exactly the same way. And as far as I'm concerned, the child psychology aspect of the JonBenet Ramsey case is vastly underestimated. I mean, just one dimension of this is the scout narrative of the Ramseys. Burke was a Cub Scout, following in the footsteps of both his older brother, John Andrew, his older half-brother, and his father. And they were both Eagle Scouts. This is a very important narrative, just about as important as JonBenet's pageant narrative, and obviously when you go into the pageant narrative you find out all sorts of things about JonBenet. You find out about her favorite food, what she wasn't allowed to eat, what was happening with her hair, her clothing, wetting the bed, sleeping habits, her health, and all that kind of thing. Whether she was allowed to draw on herself, how she was seen by her classmates, what sort of schedule she had compared to her friends, and all that kind of thing. And we need to do the same thing with her sibling. We need to look at what was the key aspect in his life. You know, what was he doing on a daily basis? What was he interested in? What was he fascinated in? And so that's what we're going to look at in this episode. I've spent quite a lot of time researching it, even though I'm really covering over old ground. I've obviously written about this before. You can get some added insight into this whole topic from a blog post, Burke is Quite the Sailor. That's from Shakedown website, and I'll put a link to that in the description. Something else just to mention is tomorrow I'll be doing a live. It's quite a rare thing. I don't do them very often. So that'll be at 1400 Eastern Standard Time on Sunday. So check that out. What we're going to be doing is I'll be taking some questions on JonBenet Ramsey, but we'll also be just looking at some news in general in true crime. We'll be looking at recent comments from the Scott Peterson case, Casey Anthony. There's a new documentary coming out on Jodi Arias in February. The new developments in the Laurie Vallow case, as well as Alexis Sharkey. So look out for all of that. Obviously, if you've got a question on the JonBenet Ramsey case, tune in on Sunday at 1400 Eastern Standard Time. Before we get to today's episode, if you haven't subscribed, please do. You can click the blue icon on the bottom right. Like, share, leave a comment. If you do share, please use the hashtag TCRS. You can share this onto Twitter, onto Facebook or something like that. And then a big thank you to the 100 or 200 who've subscribed since the last video. I see we're almost at 29,000 subscribers. So welcome to each and every one of you. And let's get started. So in this episode, I want you to visualize in your mind, again, close your eyes in a psychological sense and open your mind to this idea of, remember that female symbol, it's sort of a circle with like a plus sign under it, right? And there are almost 3 dimensions to that. There's the circle, the little bridge, and then the bar, the toggle, if you will, right? Now I want you to have that symbol in your mind and think of the 3 dimensions to what we're talking about in this episode: knives, knots, and Boy Scouts. Now you can theoretically in your mind, you can sort of imagine the loop of that symbol being the knives component, the knots being the bridge or the section connecting the loop to the toggle, and then the Boy Scout thing being the toggle, right? Just think of it that way. What I'm trying to do is I'm going to present to you 3 pieces of a puzzle, and it is going to be up to you whether they fit together. I've gotten a lot of flack on this particular topic, I think understandably, but what I want you to do is consider each of these pieces in isolation, and they need to be complete, and each piece needs to be quite fully formulated, and then once you've considered each of them in turn, you then put them together and we'll see if they fit together. Okay, so that is the point of this episode. Now obviously those on YouTube are not going to get the 3rd piece of the puzzle, which is essentially the most important piece, the bit on Boy Scouts, but it's essentially for the folks on Patreon, can you put all 3 pieces together and how well do they fit? And then the other side to that is compared to the other narrative. Compare this narrative to, let's say, the intruder narrative. And also, I think to some extent, you've got to put them on top of each other. You've got to consider the possibility, is it one theory or the intruder narrative, or could it be both? So we begin with knives, and even on this simple topic, there's confusion, as is something that we're so familiar with in the Ramsey saga. There's just so much smoke and mirrors. So on acandyrose.com, it refers to essentially 6 different knives. I'm not sure if there are as many as 6 different knives, but there's a reference to 6 different knives, being a couple of knives that are sort of pointed out on the breakfast table, and that's pointed out by John Ramsey in June 98. Then a red Swiss Army knife in the wine cellar near the blanket, that's from the Bonita papers. Then the wooden handle knife in the upstairs kitchen, which is right outside John Bonet's room, that was mentioned by Patsy Ramsey in June 98, right? That's 3 knives already. Then Patsy bought Burke a Swiss Army knife while traveling to Switzerland. That's also revealed via Patsy or by Patsy in June 98. And then Burke's name was on his Swiss Army knife, so I guess that's essentially the same knife. We don't know that for a fact. We don't know if there was 2 Swiss Army knives and his name was on one, or whether there was just one Swiss Army knife with perhaps his initials on them. And then Candy Rose actually has a question for number 6. Pocket knife found on basement counter, ? Now, for the purposes of this episode, we're not going to talk about the knives on the breakfast table. We're also not going to talk about the wooden handle knife in the upstairs kitchen, except to say that this was found right outside John Bonet's bedroom, and also that it's possible that this was part of the pageantry of the scene, that you see this knife, it doesn't belong there, and you think, wow, okay, there's something going on here, let's focus on this knife. Well, isn't the idea then that you don't pay as much attention perhaps to other knives? So the part that I really want to draw your attention to is the Bonita papers referring to a red Swiss Army knife in the wine cellar near the blanket. Now, I don't know how to be more explicit than to say this is suggesting that a red Swiss Army knife was found right next to John Bonet's body, in the same room, kind of ground zero of the crime scene. Now, something that is really crazy with this particular thing is it's mentioned in the Bonita papers, and then it doesn't seem to come up anywhere else. You don't really hear it in the police reports. You don't hear the Ramseys ever mentioning it. It never comes up in the documentary either. And so you're left with two alternatives. The one alternative is that the Bonita papers got it wrong, or that the Bonita papers got it right, but it's not the full story, that this army knife was moved to further down the crime scene in the basement, on the basement counter. In other words, it was originally in the wine cellar, and then somebody discovered it later on and then moved it somewhere else in the basement counter. And now we know there were quite a few people visiting the basement and sniffling around there and fiddling with pieces of glass and all sorts of other things. The question is, was this knife moved, or were there two knives? So one of the weird things that we don't really have certainty about. It would be great to be able to speak to Detective Steve Thomas or Kolar on this and get their opinion on it. You know, was there one knife or two? I'm not quite sure. I mean, I did research this, but I'm not quite sure what the warrants of the items seized say about it. I'm not 100% sure. The other thing that I think is very interesting about the knife is that Patsy refers to actually going to Switzerland to get this Swiss Army knife. Now, this is just my personal opinion. I'm just giving you my, and I'm speculating. I'm just giving you my version of events. It's possible that Patsy assumed that a Swiss Army knife was something that comes from Switzerland. And what I mean is that you've got to go to Switzerland to get it, right? It's also possible that she did go to Switzerland and got it there. I just don't think that is the case. I suspect that the whole story about volunteering that she got this knife while traveling to Switzerland, I mean, I don't remember in the whole narrative that I've looked at, and I could have missed something, but I don't remember the Ramseys ever going to Switzerland. Now, I know John traveled a lot, but I just don't remember Switzerland forming part of the whole saga. Do you? And it might be part of the saga, and it doesn't really matter if it does. But the flip side to that is the following. To make the statement that a Swiss Army knife comes from Switzerland is a little bit like saying, yes, I bought some cheese, I got it from the Netherlands. You don't need to go to the Netherlands to get cheese. You don't need to get rotten cheese in Denmark. You can have it in any other country. The same with a Swiss Army knife. You don't go to Switzerland to get a Swiss Army knife. And so I suspect that Swiss Army knife is actually something else. Just like the garrote isn't a garrote, I put it to you that the Swiss Army knife isn't a Swiss Army knife. It's Burke's knife for scouts, and that is also why it's got his name engraved on it. Probably because a lot of other boys have got the same kind of knife. Now, you might think that is quite a big statement to make, but in the section dealing with Boy Scouts, I'm going to explain why I say that and why there's reason to believe that almost every Boy Scout probably would have a Swiss Army knife, or a knife that is very similar to a Swiss Army knife. We do know that in the inventory of items removed from the house, there's a reference to a red pocket knife with broken ornament from the family basement, and that this was discovered by Detective Kerry Yamaguchi, and it's specifically referred to as Burke's knife, that this was Burke's knife, and that it was found on a countertop near a sink just down a basement corridor from the small basement room where John Bonet's body was found. And Hoffman Pugh was saying, well, how did the knife get there? Again, we've got to ask, did Bonita Sauer get it wrong? Or is it something that she actually got right, but that hasn't been fully fleshed out? Which officer, what is the actual source of finding this knife or seeing this knife in the wine cellar? Now, it is possible that Bonita Sauer just conflated the knife with the sort of basement as being this large area and all the items that were found in there. So it is possible that she made an error. But what about the alternative? What about the possibility that Burke's knife was used in the crime? And that's something that police have not disclosed. That's a quote from an article in the Rocky Mountain News, 1999, the 2nd of August, where they actually say police have not disclosed whether they believe Burke's knife was used in the crime. So it's entirely possible that an intruder broke in and found Burke's knife and perhaps was wearing high-tech shoes and did what he did. Perhaps he whittled the paintbrush, perhaps he cut cords or whatever, or perhaps he found it that way and then because it was handy used it. But what is interesting is police haven't said whether or not they believe Burke's knife was used. We don't know at this point. I've got to say I'm not sure about this, but I'm not sure if that knife was tested for fibers. But even if they had found the fibers of the cord, I don't know if that would be hugely significant, because wouldn't you expect to find certain fibers on a knife? I mean, I don't know if it would be a kind of game-changing revelation if you did find fibers. The same article in the Boulder Mountain News refers to the duct tape was actually torn rather than cut. And what that suggests is whoever applied the duct tape was probably a different person to the person who cut the lengths of nylon, because the lengths of nylon were they appeared to be sliced with a sharp instrument. And there's a precedent for that in a way. In the Meredith Kircher case, a piece of her bra, a bra clasp, wasn't removed. In other words, her bra wasn't removed by hand entirely. It was actually cut off with a sharp instrument. And there's also a suspect in that case that had some people refer to it as a knife fetish. But you just have a similarity where a knife is used actually at the crime scene, and in this case it was to cut the lengths of nylon cord. I'm not going to spend too much time on the nylon cord since I have already. I want to keep this discussion to knives, knots, and Boy Scouts. The thing that I want to highlight with the knots is that the cords, there were two lengths of nylon cord. So firstly, the one belonging to the toggle rope, or basically what other people refer to as the garrote, but it's basically a small piece of stick, and that is then linked to a cord or a rope with a loop on the other end. That's sometimes referred to as a commando rope or a buddy rope, and people are it's quite a well-known thing to the people that are aware of it. Anyway, so that was the one, and I think the length of that cord was 17 inches, which is around about 40 centimeters, so longer than a ruler. And then you had a second length of cord, which I think was 17 inches, or was it 20? I don't know, but they were both around about 40 centimeters, both of these lengths of cord. So if you think about the cord around JonBenét's wrists, her wrists weren't lashed together. They were tied, but she still had kind of free rein to move her hands around to some extent. Does that make sense? Now, there's been a lot of argument over the knots that you find on the nylon cord. I'm not really interested in that. I care, of course, about identifying what they are, but I think people have gotten too anal and sort of just gotten too caught up in, well, it's an adamant that it's absolutely this knot or it's that knot. And the other thing that they will then argue is they'll say, well, it's this kind of knot, and a 9-year-old would never have been able to tie this knot or whatever. And they make this argument based on their own lack of knowledge of knots. So it's based on I'm a housewife, or I'm a this or that, and while that knot looks quite complicated to me, and it's definitely technically meets that definition, and I wouldn't be able to tie that knot, so how could a 9-year-old tie it, kind of thing. That's their argument. Well, my counter argument to that is this. First of all, it's not a 9-year-old. He was about a month shy of being 10 years old. Second of all, scouts are often experts at tying knots, and when that's the case, and you might be a fisherman, you might be a sailor, and I'm not talking about a adult fisherman or an adult sailor or an adult scout. I'm talking about any kind of fisherman, sailor, or scout is going to have a better knowledge of knots than the average person. So you saying, well, a 9-year-old could never tie that, I'm sure that applies to you. A 9-year-old you could never tie that knot, and perhaps even a 90-year-old you couldn't do that. But that's totally different from someone who knows a lot about knots. And there are people who know a lot about knots, and they're not geniuses and they're not murderers. For example, rock climbers. And you can go into YouTube now and you find that knots are incredibly easy to tie. They take a couple of seconds, and there's a very simple formula for tying them. You put these two pieces together and you flip it over your finger, and then you pull it through that, and there it is. And although it's quite exotic to us, I mean, I'm someone that I've fished in my life, I've done some mountaineering in my life, I've done some camping in my life, but I wouldn't say I'm an expert with knots. I would say I'm probably average to even below average with knots. I can tie a knot, I just don't think I'm particularly good at it. But I don't think it's rocket science to know how to tie a knot. And I also don't think it's rocket science to learn how to tie sophisticated knots. If you spent one morning or half a morning just playing with strands and studying it, then I think you would learn new techniques, and it wouldn't take long. And what kind of people do that? What kind of people are interested in something like that? Well, obviously, certain people who do that ordinarily, people who tie up cargo, people who are fishermen, people who are rock climbers or campers, right? People who work as rescue, like in rescue operations, soldiers, and so on. I do think it's interesting that John Ramsey, who was an Eagle Scout himself, didn't notice the knot and say, wow, I noticed that the knots around John Bonet's wrists were this kind of knot, I was familiar with it or not familiar with it. I noticed that this thing around John Bonet's neck or around the stick, recognized that this kind of knot, or I didn't recognize it. It's interesting that as a former Eagle Scout that's not there. And so I must say I'm very, I can sympathize with people who say, I think this is a total tangent, it's totally irrelevant because the Ramseys never talk about it. It's not mentioned in their books, and we're going to get to this part in the Patreon section, is just the absence, the almost total absence of even mentioning the word scout. And I'm talking about in almost all the narratives regarding this case. We're talking about Steve Thomas's book, and there are 2 references to scouts, and we're going to go through that in the Patreon section. But the fact is that it's just very underreported. It's something that's not really mentioned. We're going to also deal with it in Perfect Murder, Perfect Town, and in The Death of Innocence. Just these references to scouts, and it's often not even a direct reference to it. It's referring to someone whose name was Scout in the case of Steve Thomas's resignation letter, or the idea of scouting around. It's not even actually to scouts. And so you have this vital aspect of Burke's upbringing that is completely left out of the narrative. And you would ask, just like with the bicycle narrative, is it purposefully left out? Is it just not important? What's the story? And if you take the first 2 pieces of the puzzle and you say, okay, there was a knife. Was it a Swiss Army knife, or was it a Swiss knife for scouting? Then you look at the knot and you say, was this was this knot made by a sophisticated pedophile intruder that perhaps had a background in scouts or climbing mountains or something, or was it something that is more typical of another area? And then you look at the knives and the knots and you say, is there a link between the two? Because we know from the police report that somebody used a knife to cut the nylon that was responsible for making these knots. Now, who might do that? So I'm going to conclude this part of the episode by just showing you some photos of JonBenet where she's posing for photos with rope beside her. And I want you to concentrate on the rope that you're looking at, and then have a look at the rope, a piece of rope that was found in John Andrews' bedroom, and then look at a very familiar, very typical, a classic implement used by scouts known as a toggle rope. And then I want you to compare that to the quote-unquote Ramsey garrote. And so while everybody's been fixated on, is it a Prusik knot, is it a Prusik hitch, is it a clove hitch, is it a girth hitch, is it a Blake hitch, is it a bowline knot, is it this, is it that? I think people have missed not seeing the woods for the trees. Aren't we talking about a buddy rope here? Who cares about the knot? Who cares what it is exactly? What is this thing that has a loop, a length of cord, and a handle? What is that? Where else can we find it? And isn't the answer, well, it's a buddy rope. It's also known as a commander rope. It's something soldiers used very often in the First and Second World War, and it's also something very often used by scouts. And so I think it's worth asking, was the intruder potentially a scout? So for those on YouTube, I'm not going to take it further than that. If you'd like to get the rest of this episode, and there'll be another 10 episodes in the series on Patreon, then head on to patreon.com/TCRS. Thank you to the 200 or so who've joined Patreon since this series started. And otherwise, I will see you guys next time. Thank you for listening. So on August 7th, 1998, the Boulder Daily Camera published Detective Steve Thomas's resignation letter. And in it, he referred, right at the end of his resignation letter, he referred to the word scout.